In the long list of never-ending debates in the gaming community, the discourse around the nostalgia for old games is one of the most prevalent. Is the love for retro games legitimate or rose-tinted? Without throwing myself into the public discourse, for a while, it was an internal debate I would have occasionally. Time and time again, I find examples of legitimacy behind the nostalgia, most of which from me delving into games from the past, or the sea of remakes of games from a different era. Particularly, those such as the two that made my list this year. Check those out if you haven't seen them already. But sometimes I stumble upon a modern gem that wears its retro inspirations on its sleeves. Turbo Overkill is one of those gems. Not just because of its boomer shooter aesthetic, but its overall design. It skillfully blends modern and retro into something magical. So much so that it helped me finally understand what it is about old school video games that often keep me coming back more than just the average modern video game made today. If you've played any boomer shooter, current or retro, then you're familiar with paper-thin or surface-level stories. And Turbo Overkill isn't breaking the mold in that aspect by any stretch of the phrase. That's not to say there's nothing interesting about it, however. You play as Johnny Turbo, a merc for hire, also known as a street cleaner in the game's cyberpunk world. Your job is to stop a rogue AI called Sin from completely taking over the world and turning people into fleshy mechanical abominations.
I sin. And I see all.
On top of this, Johnny is trying to earn the money he needs for an expensive surgery to have his brain and memories reimplanted after nearly meeting his end, RoboCop style, thus throwing in a hint of revenge into the story cocktail.
Whoa, pucker up and kiss this for me, Johnny!
You meet plenty of characters throughout the story, such as Sam, an AI companion, an effective mouthpiece for Johnny.
Or you could do that, I suppose. Ouch, by the way. You know I'm in here, don't you? I have feelings, Johnny.
Outside of Sam, most of the characters are hit or miss in terms of likability, compounded by inconsistent voice acting. As the game was an early access release, it's pretty easy to tell at what point in development the story had increased in priority. Regardless, it's a fun ride that doesn't take itself too seriously, which is more than enough for me. But let me get into the reason why I love this game. If I had to describe Turbo Overkill's gameplay to the average person, think Doom and Titanfall gave birth to a child with a chainsaw leg and a mechanical hand that shoots mini missiles. They took modern and retro and mixed them together like peanut butter and jelly. Fast-paced and momentum-based, which pleases me greatly as a reluctant Sonic fan. Outside of blasting everything into a fine mist or ground beef, you can slide, dash, double jump, wall run, and grappling hook your way to success. But what helps the game stand out from the norm is the augment system. You can effectively modify and specialize Johnny to suit your playstyle. Love wall running and want to use it to your advantage? Equip the augment that allows you to stop mid-run and pick your targets off while still attached to the wall. Or if you're an old school Tony Hawk fan like me, equip the augment that lets you kick off of walls, keeping your movement momentum going and never touching the ground again. Is one chainsaw leg not doing it for you? Then how about two? Become the chainsaw man you were always meant to be. And let's not forget the continued upgrades that are doled out throughout the game. But I'd be remiss if I didn't discuss the game's level design, taking you from dirty alleys to high-speed highways and moving trains to toxic factories and active war zones, from the ground to planetary orbit. The game's level design is a roller coaster from start to finish. It's not to say that all levels are perfect, of course, and you can tell that some levels clearly had more attention given to them than others. This becomes even more pronounced as the levels become more complex in later episodes, as there are 3 episodes in total, each with 8 levels apiece. Some later levels can take nearly a half an hour to finish due to their length alone, but even with this, the game keeps things interesting by throwing new events at you per level. Wall running and the grappling hook opens up a level of verticality, taking me back to my time with Titanfall 2. Platforming in first-person shooters can be a difficult challenge to pull off successfully from a design perspective. While Turbo Overkill doesn't nail that challenge on all fronts, there is a cohesiveness to the platforming and level design. Then there's sections ranging from piloting a flying combat car to a hoverbike with machine guns, and more. However, the hoverbike section could have used more time in the incubator for polish and refinement. This is even after the constant updates it got during early access. Toss in a few collectibles to find, secret levels to unlock, an end-of-level scoring system, and you have yourself a true boomer shooter from the top down. Because of all this, Turbo Overkill made me miss something that is perhaps a lost art in modern video games. Level design. Actual level design. Not the kind you see in sprawling open worlds littered with bits and pieces that designers threw in but had to compromise because it needed to make sense in game. Nor prefabricated pieces of design that are stitched together randomly by an algorithm, outputting something that feels soulless, but something that you can feel the designers had the freedom to have fun with, resulting in something just fun to do and engage with, even if it makes absolutely no sense. And you can't have a first-person shooter without guns, and Turbo Overkill has them in abundance, featuring 9 guns in total, each with their own alternate firing modes and purchasable upgrades, far more than the games it takes inspiration from. I found myself leaning towards the dual Uzis and Hammer of Dawn. Just kidding, the Ion Blaster. But my favorite weapon, based on the concept alone, is the Telefragger, a sniper rifle with an alternate firing mode that lets you teleport inside of enemies and explode them from the inside out. Its primary use is letting you travel across great expanses quickly, where dashing and double jumping simply won't get you there. But the idea is still really cool. Even with all these weapons, the game doesn't try to funnel you into using specific weapons for specific combat situations or enemy types. Yes, some weapons are more effective than others against different enemy types, and you can learn about that from the bestiary. But I never felt punished for ignoring it and playing how I wanted to. Most of the weapons feel great to use in combat, minus the rocket launcher that admittedly feels pretty weak compared to the rest. Even more so when upgrading the damage for the mini missiles. If that's not enough for you, you'll also find Quake or Unreal Tournament style power-ups in combat arenas, which make for some hilariously broken moments. Alright, I think I made my point about the gameplay. It's good fun that I continue to come back to again and again, but I gotta move on to the stuff around it.
Rejoice, for paradise is sin. But this is just the beginning.
If you made it this far into the video, then you probably noticed the game is no technical showpiece, by any definition. It's going for the old school quick look that's pretty popular amongst modern boomer shooters. A look that works if you're trying to appeal to a specific crowd while being mindful that you're not a AAA studio, nor do you have the staff or the budget of one. And it also works for that filthy, grimy cyberpunk city look it's shooting for. Because it's not a visual showpiece, it also opens the door for high frame rates on high refresh rate monitors. Something very beneficial to fast-paced, twitchy shooters of this ilk. And it doesn't require top-of-the-line hardware to play, considering it's only on PC at the time of this video. It also has native controller support, which tells me that console ports are definitely in the works. But even with its lower-end visuals, it still pulls off some pretty neat tricks from a technical standpoint. On some levels, the game deceives the player with an almost Truman Show-like effect. What once looked like a boundless area is actually a breakable wall, potentially revealing a new path behind it. Secret items are sometimes hidden in these areas as well. Then there's the soundtrack, which turned out to be one of my favorites this year. It doesn't break any new ground, though. In the same way Doom's soundtrack complements its gameplay, the concept also applies to Turbo Overkill. Instead of industrial metal, the game focuses on high-energy techno and EDM, with a little bit of rock thrown into the mix. However, the themes of the tracks change over the course of the game. As things become more desperate and the sin infestation spreads, songs become slightly more twisted and off-sounding. Themes change per episode, with the final, episode 3, giving off a grand finale feel when it incorporates brass and string instruments. While the soundtrack isn't helmed by just a single composer, all 3 composers seem to understand the theme the game is going for and manage to bring something together that sounds consistent, avoiding the too many cooks problem that other games fall prey to. It's the soundtrack playing throughout this video and something I continue to listen to occasionally. Turbo Overkill was the surprise hit of the year for me, even considering that I played portion of it during its early access period. Fascinating watching the scope of the game change during its early access period. Watching the developer constantly patch and update the hoverbike section, which wasn't originally a hoverbike, was intriguing and amusing. It's still not perfect, but it's much better than when it was a standard motorcycle with guns. Regardless, cases like these show that indie games are picking up the slack, where the AAA space is practically imploding on itself. They embrace the fact that they're video games, and focusing on that fact has brought the fun factor back to something I once thought was lost. No overly expensive tech, no Hollywood celebs inflating development costs, just a video game-ass video game, which has proven to be one of its greatest strengths amongst the competition. I think the length of the gameplay section of this video alone validates that, and is why Turbo Overkill is my favorite game of 2023.